He said he didn't want a child with someone like me. His mother agreed. His sister said I wouldn't last in their house anyway. A week later I was pushed down the stairs. I left without a word. His dinner tasted fine. Until he read the note taped beneath his plate. Infertile now. The plate shattered against the marble floor, ceramic fragments scattering like broken promises across the kitchen tiles. I stood frozen, my 5-month pregnant belly pressed against the counter's edge, watching Alex's mother Stephanie's face twist into something I'd never seen before, pure, undiluted disgust. "You clumsy fool," she hissed, her voice dripping with the kind of venom that makes your skin crawl. "Can't even hold a simple dinner plate without destroying it." This wasn't about the plate. It never was. When I first walked into the Turner family home 18 months ago, arm in arm with Alex after our courthouse wedding, I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. The Victorian mansion stood like a monument to old money, with its towering columns and manicured gardens that belonged in magazine spreads. Alex had described his family as traditional but welcoming. I should have paid more attention to the word traditional. Stephanie Turner was a woman who commanded rooms without speaking, her silver hair always perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid as a general's. She smiled at our wedding photos, posed graciously for pictures, even complimented my dress. But I caught her studying me when she thought I wasn't looking, the way a scientist examines a specimen under a microscope. "She's different from what we expected," I overheard her telling Georgia, Alex's sister, during our engagement party. The way she said different made it sound like a disease. Georgia was worse. While Stephanie maintained a facade of politeness, Georgia didn't bother pretending. She was 28, unmarried, and bitter about it. Everything I did became a target for her passive-aggressive comments. When I rearranged the living room furniture to create more space, she announced loudly that some people don't understand family traditions. When I cooked dinner using my grandmother's recipes, she'd push food around her plate and declare she wasn't hungry for experimental cuisine. But Alex, my Alex, had been my sanctuary. During our courtship he'd been attentive, gentle, the kind of man who remembered small details like how I preferred my coffee or which songs made me smile. He worked as an accountant for a prestigious firm downtown, steady and reliable. When he proposed on a quiet evening in his apartment, away from his family's watchful eyes, I felt like I'd finally found my safe harbor after years of turbulent relationships. The first crack appeared when I announced my pregnancy. I'd planned it perfectly, waiting until Sunday dinner when the whole family gathered around Stephanie's polished mahogany table. I placed the ultrasound photo next to Alex's plate, my heart hammering with excitement. This was supposed to be our moment of joy, the beginning of our real family. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Alex stared at the image, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Stephanie's face went completely blank, as if someone had erased all expression from it. Georgia actually laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that made my stomach lurch. "Well," Stephanie finally said, dabbing her lips with her napkin, "this is unexpected." Unexpected. Not congratulations. Not expressions of joy about their first grandchild. Just unexpected. Alex cleared his throat. "We should discuss this privately," he mumbled, avoiding my eyes. That night, lying in our bed while Alex faced away from me, I tried to rationalize their reaction. Maybe they were shocked. Maybe they needed time to adjust. Maybe traditional families processed news differently than I was used to. But as weeks passed, the atmosphere in the house grew poisonous. Stephanie began making pointed comments about young women who rush into motherhood without considering the consequences. She'd leave pregnancy books around the house, not the encouraging kind, but clinical texts about high-risk pregnancies and complications. When I'd find them, she'd feign surprise. "Oh, those old things. I was just doing some research." You can never be too prepared for difficulties. Georgia escalated her campaign of psychological warfare. She'd invite friends over who'd gush about their own pregnancies within earshot, then pointedly exclude me from conversations. When I experienced morning sickness, she'd complain loudly about the smell of whatever I was cooking, forcing me to eat crackers in my room like a prisoner. But the most devastating change was in Alex. My husband, the man who once traced my face with gentle fingers and whispered promises about our future, began treating me like an inconvenience. He'd come home later each evening claiming urgent projects at work. When I'd try to discuss baby names or nursery plans, he'd change the subject or suddenly remember urgent phone calls he needed to make. "Maybe we should wait," he said one evening, his voice clinical and detached. "I've been thinking about our finances, our career plans. Maybe this isn't the right timing." The way he said this instead of "our baby" sent ice through my veins. I caught whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Phone calls taken behind closed doors. Glances exchanged between the three of them that excluded me completely, like I was some unwelcome outsider who'd somehow infiltrated their perfect world. The house itself seemed to turn against me. Floors that had once felt welcoming now felt hostile under my feet. Family photos lining the hallways, generations of Turners with their identical cold eyes, seemed to watch me with disapproval. Even my own reflection in the antique mirrors scattered throughout the mansion looked foreign, like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. At 5 months, when my pregnancy became undeniably visible, the pretense finally crumbled completely. That Tuesday evening I was carrying a tray of dishes upstairs. Stephanie insisted on eating in the formal dining room, then expected someone to clean up afterward. My back ached, my feet were swollen, but I'd learned that complaining only invited more scrutiny. The stairs in the Turner house were grand and sweeping, designed for dramatic entrances rather than practical navigation. As I reached the landing, balancing the heavy tray against my growing belly, I felt it, a sudden forceful shove between my shoulder blades. Time fragmented. The tray flew from my hands, china exploding against the walls. My body twisted, my arms instinctively wrapping around my stomach as I tumbled down those unforgiving wooden steps. Each impact sent shockwaves of agony through my spine, my ribs, my soul. When I finally stopped moving, crumpled at the bottom of the staircase like a broken doll, the pain was excruciating. But worse than the physical agony was the sound drifting from the top of the stairs. Hushed voices, not calling for help, not expressing concern. Just satisfied whispers. And in that moment, sprawled on the cold marble floor with my baby's life hanging in the balance, I finally understood the truth about the family I'd married into. They'd never wanted me to succeed. They'd been waiting for me to fall. The emergency room doctor's face was professionally neutral as she pressed the ultrasound wand against my bruised abdomen. I held my breath, waiting for words that would either save or destroy what remained of my world. The steady rhythm of my baby's heartbeat filled the sterile room like a defiant war drum. "Everything looks normal," she said, her voice carrying the relief I couldn't yet allow myself to feel. "Your baby is strong. But you need to be more careful on those stairs. More careful." As if my tumble down the Turner family staircase had been an accident. I smiled and nodded, playing the part of the clumsy pregnant woman who'd simply lost her footing. The bruises painting my ribs in shades of purple and yellow told a different story, but I kept that narrative to myself. Some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, especially when you're surrounded by people who benefit from your silence. The ride back to the mansion felt like traveling toward my own execution. Alex drove with his usual mechanical precision, his hands gripping the steering wheel at exactly 10 and 2 o'clock. He asked the required questions about my condition, made the appropriate concerned sounds, but his eyes never quite met mine in the rearview mirror. "Maybe you should rest more," he suggested as we pulled into the circular driveway. "Pregnancy can make women unsteady." Unsteady. Another carefully chosen word to rewrite history. That night, lying in our bed while Alex's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, I made my decision. But not the one they expected. They wanted me broken, defeated, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they might allow me to keep. Instead, I would become something far more dangerous, invisible. For 3 weeks I played my part perfectly. I moved through their house like a ghost, speaking only when spoken to, keeping my eyes downcast, appearing to shrink further into myself with each passing day. Stephanie's satisfied smiles grew more frequent. Georgia actually hummed while arranging flowers, as if my spirit's apparent breaking had lifted some invisible weight from her shoulders. But while they celebrated their perceived victory, I was studying them with the intensity of a scientist observing lab specimens. I learned Stephanie's schedule down to the minute. Her morning yoga sessions, her weekly bridge club meetings, her Thursday afternoon visits to the country club. I memorized Georgia's habits, her tendency to leave important documents scattered across her desk, her complete reliance on prescription anxiety medication that she kept in an unlocked bathroom cabinet. Most importantly, I watched Alex. My husband had patterns, routines as predictable as clockwork. He ate the same breakfast every morning, left for work at exactly 7:30, returned home at precisely 6:15 unless he had one of his increasingly frequent late meetings. He trusted me to prepare his meals, never questioning what went into his food or where the ingredients came from. That trust would prove to be his downfall. My undergraduate degree in chemistry had been something I'd mentioned only once during our courtship, describing it as something I studied before finding my real passion. Alex had nodded politely and changed the subject to something he found more interesting, probably his golf handicap or quarterly tax projections. He'd never bothered to ask about my real passion, never wondered what I'd actually learned during those 4 years of studying molecular structures and chemical interactions. His indifference to my education became my greatest weapon. The plan crystallized during one of my sleepless nights. Lying awake while phantom pains from my fall reminded me exactly how expendable the Turner family considered me. They wanted me gone, but they needed it to look natural, accidental. An unfortunate miscarriage followed by a quiet divorce, leaving Alex free to marry someone more suitable to their social standing. But I had different plans entirely. I began with small preparations. During my carefully orchestrated grocery trips, I purchased specific items from different stores, never buying everything I needed from one location. The pharmacist who sold me certain over-the-counter medications saw only a pregnant woman dealing with morning sickness. The health food store clerk who provided specialized herbs assumed I was exploring natural pregnancy remedies. None of them could have imagined how these innocent purchases would combine into something far more sophisticated. My final week in that house was a masterpiece of deception. I moved through their daily routines like a method actor preparing for the role of a lifetime. When Stephanie made her cruel comments about some women not being cut out for motherhood, I nodded submissively. When Georgia complained about the burden of having an unstable sister-in-law, I apologized for existing. Meanwhile, I was documenting everything. Phone numbers found in Alex's jacket pockets. Strange receipts discovered in his car. Conversations overheard through thin walls. Financial documents left carelessly on his desk. I photographed everything with a small camera I'd purchased during one of my shopping trips, storing the images safely away from prying eyes. The night before my departure, I prepared Alex's favorite meal with extraordinary care. Beef Wellington, exactly the way his mother had taught me during one of our early false moments of bonding. I spent hours on the presentation making sure every detail was perfect. The golden pastry crust, the tender meat, the rich mushroom duxelle that masked any subtle variations in flavor. Alex complimented the meal enthusiastically, actually smiling at me for the first time in weeks. "This is incredible," he said, cutting into the pastry with obvious pleasure. "You've really outdone yourself." I watched him eat every bite, my expression serene as a Madonna painting. After dinner, while he settled into his usual evening routine of reviewing financial reports, I completed my final preparations. A small duffel bag packed with essentials hidden in the back of my closet. Cash I'd been carefully accumulating over months, withdrawn in small amounts to avoid detection. Documents proving my identity, my education, my existence independent of the Turner family name. And one small note written in my careful handwriting, containing just 2 words that would eventually explain everything he'd never bothered to learn about the woman he'd married. The next morning, before dawn painted the sky gray, I taped that note to the underside of his breakfast plate. By the time Alex discovered my goodbye message, I would be just another woman who'd disappeared into the anonymous crowds of the city, carrying secrets that would reshape his entire world. They thought they'd won by pushing me down those stairs. They had no idea I'd been planning to fly all along. The fluorescent light above the delivery table flickered like a dying candle, casting intermittent shadows across the cramped room at St. Mary's Community Clinic. No soft lighting, no soothing music, no husband holding my hand. Just me, a tired-looking midwife named Rosa, and the overwhelming need to push. "One more, honey," Rosa encouraged, her weathered hands steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "I can see the head." The pain was nothing compared to what I'd endured in that mansion, but the fear was different now. Not fear of what they might do to me, but terror that something might happen to this child before I could prove he existed. This baby was my vindication, my secret weapon, my reason for surviving everything they'd thrown at me. When Liam finally slipped into the world at 3:47 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning, his cry pierced through the clinic's thin walls like a battle horn announcing victory. Rosa placed him on my chest and I stared into eyes that were unmistakably Turner eyes, the same steel-gray color that had stared at me with such contempt, now gazing up at me with pure, innocent trust. "He's perfect," Rosa whispered, cleaning him with gentle efficiency. "Look at those lungs on him. Perfect." They tried to eliminate perfection before it could draw breath. The birth certificate felt like holding dynamite when the clerk handed it to me 3 days later. "Baby boy Turner," it read, though I'd already decided on his real name. Liam Alexander Turner, carrying his father's middle name like a sword he didn't know he possessed yet. My first apartment was a single room above a Vietnamese restaurant in the city's forgotten district, where rent was paid weekly and landlords didn't ask too many questions. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation from the family downstairs, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I controlled my own space, my own schedule, my own destiny. The money I'd saved during my final weeks at the mansion lasted exactly 6 weeks. After that, survival became a daily mathematical equation. Formula: costs versus bus fare, diapers versus electricity, my son's needs against my own exhaustion. I found work wherever I could disappear into the background. Monday mornings I cleaned office buildings before dawn, Liam sleeping in his carrier while I vacuumed boardrooms where men in expensive suits made decisions that would never touch their own families. Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I walked dogs for wealthy residents who lived in penthouses overlooking the same streets where I counted coins for groceries. But it was the sewing that saved us both. Mrs. Chin, who owned the alterations shop 2 blocks from our apartment, noticed me repairing Liam's outgrown clothes with stitches so precise they looked machine-made. She offered me piecework at first, hemming pants, taking in waists, mending tiers. When she realized I could handle more complex alterations, she began sending me home with wedding dresses that needed complete reconstruction. "You have gift," she told me one afternoon, examining a beaded gown I'd resized from a size 16 to a size 8 without disturbing a single sequin. "Where you learn?" I'd learned from necessity, from YouTube videos watched during Liam's naps, from trial and error that I couldn't afford to get wrong. But I just smiled and said, "Practice." Working late into the night while Liam slept became my meditation. Each stitch was a small act of defiance against the people who'd tried to reduce me to nothing. Every completed garment proved I could create beauty from broken pieces, transform something unwanted into something valuable. Martha Rodriguez changed everything on a particularly brutal December evening when Liam had been crying for hours with what I suspected was an ear infection. I was pacing our tiny room, bouncing him against my shoulder while calculating whether I could afford both antibiotics and next week's rent, when she knocked on my door. Martha was 73 years old, with silver hair braided down her back and hands that told stories of decades spent working with fabric. She owned the tailoring shop on the ground floor of the building next door, and I'd noticed her watching me come and go with Liam bundled against my chest. "Mija," she said when I opened the door, taking in my tear-streaked face and Liam's fevered cries. "You need help." She didn't wait for an answer. Within minutes she'd called her nephew, who was a pediatric nurse, arranged for medicine to be delivered, and made a pot of soup that filled our room with the first homey smell it had known. "I have space upstairs," she said while spooning broth into my mouth like I was another child who needed tending. 2 rooms, small kitchen. Rent same as here but quieter. Better for babies. I started to protest. I couldn't afford to owe anyone anything, couldn't risk depending on kindness that might be withdrawn. But Martha waved away my concerns with flour-dusted fingers. "You look like someone who's been through war," she said simply. I recognized the look. I came here from El Salvador in 1979 with nothing but my sewing machine and my grandson. Sometimes we need angels and sometimes we need to be angels. Today I'm your angel. The apartment above Martha's shop became our sanctuary. 2 small rooms with windows that actually opened, a kitchen where I could cook real meals instead of heating formula and instant noodles, and most importantly, a woman downstairs who never asked where Liam's father was or why I'd appeared in her neighborhood with nothing but determination and a baby who smiled like sunshine. I documented everything with obsessive precision. Every doctor's visit, every milestone, every photo of Liam growing from a tiny infant into a toddler with his father's stubborn chin and his grandfather's intelligent eyes. I kept receipts, vaccination records, even the hospital bracelet from his birth. Something deep in my bones whispered that proof would matter someday. Martha taught me to cut patterns, to work with silk and organza, to create garments that made women feel beautiful on the most important days of their lives. In return, I helped modernize her business, teaching her to use social media to attract younger customers, organizing her inventory systems, bringing efficiency to her warm chaos. "You have good hands," she'd say, watching me work late into the evening while Liam played with fabric scraps at my feet. "But more than that, you have good heart. Broken maybe, but good." Liam's first word was "Mama," spoken clearly on a Saturday morning while I hemmed a bridesmaid's dress. His first steps were taken across Martha's shop floor, reaching for a pincushion that glittered like treasure in his 18-month-old eyes. His first complete sentence was, "Mama, pretty dress," pointing at a wedding gown I was beading for a client. Every milestone felt like a small victory against the people who'd tried to prevent his existence. They'd pushed me down those stairs believing they could erase us both. Instead, they'd only made us stronger, more determined, more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. At night, after Martha had gone upstairs to her own apartment and Liam was finally asleep, I'd sit at my sewing machine and smile while thinking about Alex. I wondered if he'd discovered my note yet, if he'd tried to start a family with someone new, if he'd learned the truth about what I'd left him. I hoped he had. I hoped he'd tried everything. Because that's when he'd discover what I'd known all along. Some things once broken can never be repaired. The phone rang while I was teaching Liam to tie his shoes, his small fingers fumbling with the laces as morning sunlight streamed through Martha's shop windows. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or telemarketers, neither of which I had time for while balancing a toddler and 3 wedding dress alterations due by Friday. "Is this the mother of Liam Alexander Turner?" The voice was professional, measured, with the kind of careful diction that belonged to courtrooms and law offices. My blood turned to ice. Nobody knew that name except me, the hospital, and whoever had issued his birth certificate. I'd been so careful, so invisible for almost 2 years. "Who's asking?" I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "My name is Clayton Hendricks. I'm an attorney representing the Turner estate. I need to verify some information regarding a child born approximately 22 months ago." Turner estate. The words hit me like a physical blow. I set Liam down gently, watching him toddle toward his toy box while my mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Had they found us? Were they coming to take him away? Had Alex somehow discovered his son existed? "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I have a birth certificate here that says otherwise. Liam Alexander Turner, born at St. Mary's Community Clinic. Mother listed as Sarah Elizabeth Turner." Clayton's voice softened slightly. "I'm not calling to cause trouble. There's been a development regarding the family estate that requires immediate clarification. Sarah Elizabeth Turner." I'd kept Alex's last name on all of Liam's documents, partly for practical reasons and partly because some vindictive part of me wanted that connection to exist in writing. Now that decision was coming back to haunt me in ways I'd never anticipated. "What kind of development?" I asked, sinking into Martha's worn velvet chair while Liam built towers with wooden blocks, blissfully unaware that his entire world might be about to change. Clayton paused and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Are you familiar with Kyle Turner? Alex's father." Kyle Turner. I'd met him exactly twice before he passed away from a heart attack 6 months into my marriage. He'd been quieter than the rest of his family, more observant. During our brief conversations, he'd asked me about my education, my background, my plans, questions that seemed genuine rather than judgmental. Unlike Stephanie and Georgia, Kyle had never made me feel like an intruder in his home. "Yes, I met him a few times," I said carefully. "Mr. Turner passed away 14 months ago. We've been handling his estate, but there's been a complication. A rather significant one." Clayton's voice took on the tone of someone delivering news that would fundamentally alter lives. Kyle Turner amended his will shortly before his death. The changes were unconventional. My hands were shaking now. Liam looked up from his blocks, sensing my distress with the intuitive radar that toddlers possess. I forced a smile and motioned for him to continue playing. "What kind of changes?" "The entirety of the Turner estate, The house, the investment properties, the business holdings, everything was left to his biological grandson. Not to Alex, not to Stephanie, not to Georgia. To his grandson specifically, with the stipulation that the inheritance would only transfer upon proof of the child's existence and Alex's inability to produce future heirs. The room spun around me. Kyle had known. Somehow that quiet old man had seen through his family's facade and understood exactly what kind of people they really were. He'd written a will that would reward the very thing they tried to destroy. I don't understand, I said, though understanding was beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. What does this have to do with my son? Mrs. Turner, according to our records, your son is Kyle Turner's only biological grandson. The family has been attempting to proceed with the sale of several properties, claiming no heir exists. But if your son is alive and can be verified as Alex Turner's biological child, then he is the legal owner of approximately $12 million in assets. $12 million. The number echoed in my head like a struck bell. Liam, my beautiful boy who played with cardboard boxes because we couldn't afford proper toys, was worth $12 million. And they tried to eliminate him before he could draw his first breath. They told you he died? I asked, pieces clicking into place with crystalline clarity. Clayton's professional composure cracked slightly. Yes. The family provided documentation indicating that you'd suffered a miscarriage and subsequently left the family home. They claimed there was no surviving heir. Documentation. They'd forged papers, created false records, built an entire lie around my son's supposed death. The fall down the stairs hadn't been just attempted violence. It had been the first step in covering up his existence entirely. Mr. Hendricks, I said, my voice gaining strength as fury began to overtake fear. I think we need to meet in person. And I think you need to see some documents of my own. 2 days later, I stood outside the granite facade of Hendricks, Watson and Associates with Liam's hand clasped firmly in mine and a manila envelope containing 2 years' worth of carefully preserved evidence tucked under my arm. Clayton Hendricks turned out to be a man in his 50s with kind eyes and silver hair, nothing like the predatory attorneys I'd imagined based on television dramas. His office was all leather chairs and law books, but he'd arranged a small play area in the corner with blocks and picture books, a thoughtful gesture that immediately put me at ease. You brought him, Clayton said, his voice filled with something approaching awe as he watched Liam explore the toys with fearless curiosity. I brought proof, I corrected, settling the envelope on his mahogany desk. Birth certificate, hospital records, vaccination documentation, DNA samples if you need them. Everything required to prove that Liam Alexander Turner is exactly who I say he is. Clayton opened the envelope with the reverence of someone handling historical artifacts. As he examined each document, his expression shifted from professional interest to shocked recognition to something approaching anger. Mrs. Turner, he said finally, looking up from Liam's birth certificate with eyes that held newfound respect. They told me your child died in a miscarriage. They showed me fabricated medical records. They've been lying to me for over a year. They've been lying about more than that, I said, watching Liam stack blocks with the focused determination he'd inherited from his grandfather. They didn't just claim he died, Mr. Hendricks. They tried to make sure he did. As I told Clayton about the fall, about the whispered conversations, about the systematic cruelty designed to eliminate both me and my pregnancy, I watched his face harden into something resembling granite. By the time I finished, he was gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Do you understand what this means? He asked quietly. I looked at my son, this miracle child who'd survived everything they'd thrown at us, and smiled. It means they lost. Clayton's private investigator was worth every penny I couldn't afford to pay him. 3 weeks after our meeting, he delivered a manila folder thick with surveillance photos and documents that painted a picture of Alex's new life. A life built on the foundation of my supposed disappearance and our son's alleged death. Her name was Victoria Ashford, daughter of a pharmaceutical fortune, educated at Swiss boarding schools and Ivy League universities. The engagement photos showed a woman with perfect bone structure and the kind of confident smile that comes from never having to worry about rent money. She was everything the Turner family had probably hoped I would be: wealthy, connected, and blissfully ignorant of their capacity for cruelty. The wedding is scheduled for Saturday, Clayton reported during our follow-up meeting. St. Michael's Cathedral, followed by a reception at the country club. 500 guests, including several city council members and the mayor. I studied the invitation he'd somehow obtained, noting the elegant calligraphy and cream-colored cardstock that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Everything about it screamed old money and social prominence. Exactly the kind of spectacle the Turner family would orchestrate to announce their triumphant return to respectability. And the medical tests? I asked, though I already knew the answer from Clayton's barely suppressed smile. Completed last Tuesday. Standard premarital health screening required by Ms. Ashford's family. Very thorough. Very revealing. He slid another document across his desk. The results were sent directly to both parties this morning. I didn't need to read the clinical language to understand what those test results contained. The note I'd left under Alex's plate 2 years ago hadn't been a threat. It had been a promise. And promises, unlike marriages, were meant to be kept. The irony wasn't lost on me that Victoria Ashford discovered her fiancé's infertility on what should have been the happiest morning of her life. I imagined her sitting in some luxury hotel suite, surrounded by bridesmaids and wedding planners, when the email arrived with news that would shatter every future she'd envisioned. According to Clayton's contact at the hospital, a nurse who happened to be Martha's niece, the conversation between Victoria and Alex that morning had been brief and devastating. Alex had tried to explain, to minimize, to suggest they could explore other options. Victoria had listened in silence, then asked a single question that ended everything. How long have you known? His inability to answer honestly had told her everything she needed to know. The cathedral bells were ringing 11 o'clock when Victoria Ashford walked down the aisle for the last time as his intended bride. Clayton's investigator had positioned himself discreetly in the back pew, camera hidden, ready to document what would become the most talked-about wedding disaster in the city's recent memory. She looked ethereal in her custom Vera Wang gown, a vision of ivory silk and French lace that had taken 8 months to create. The 5-carat diamond on her finger caught the stained glass light as she moved with practiced grace toward the altar where Alex waited in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. But something was wrong. The guests sensed it first, a tension that rippled through the cathedral like wind across water. Victoria's steps were too measured, too deliberate. Her expression was serene, but her eyes held the cold fury of a woman who'd discovered she'd been built a life on lies. She stopped 6 feet from the altar. Close enough for Alex to see the knowledge in her eyes, far enough away to ensure her words would carry to the back pews. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice clear and steady as cathedral bells. "I want to thank you all for coming today to witness what was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful marriage." Alex's face went ashen. Stephanie half rose from her front row seat, her mouth opening in a silent protest. Georgia gripped her purse like a weapon, as if expensive leather could somehow protect her from the tsunami that was building. "Unfortunately," Victoria continued, turning to face the congregation with the poise of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people, "I've recently learned that my fiancé has been less than honest about certain fundamental aspects of our future together." The silence in the cathedral was so complete that the rustle of her dress sounded like thunder as she reached into her bouquet and withdrew a folded document. "This morning, I received the results of Alex's fertility testing." Her voice never wavered, never rose, never betrayed the emotional earthquake that must have been occurring beneath her composed exterior. Tests that revealed he is completely and irreversibly sterile. A condition he has apparently been aware of for quite some time. The gasps from the congregation created a sound like wind through autumn leaves. Alex tried to step toward her, his hand extended in supplication, but Victoria's expression stopped him cold. "You told me you wanted children," she said, finally allowing emotion to creep into her voice. Not anger, but something far more devastating: disappointment. "You let me plan our family. You let me imagine our future. You let me believe in a lie." She let the fertility report flutter to the cathedral floor like a fallen prayer. "I will not marry a man who begins our union with deception. I will not tie my life to someone who views honesty as optional." Victoria turned back to the congregation, her chin raised with dignity that would have made queens envious. "This wedding is cancelled. The reception is cancelled. Your presence here today will serve as witness not to a marriage, but to the importance of truth in all our relationships." With that, she turned and walked back down the aisle, her train trailing behind her like a river of silk and shattered dreams. The cathedral doors closed behind her with a sound like thunder, leaving behind 500 guests and a family whose carefully constructed world had just imploded. Stephanie's wail echoed off the stone walls, a sound of pure anguish that spoke to the loss of more than just a wedding. Georgia began screaming at Clayton, who had appeared as if materialized from the shadows to serve the legal papers that would transfer the Turner estate to its rightful heir. Alex stood frozen at the altar, his tuxedo suddenly looking like a costume for a play that had ended without his permission. The fertility report lay at his feet like evidence at a crime scene, proof of the lie that had finally caught up with him. I wasn't there to witness the chaos firsthand, but Martha's niece called me that evening with details that spread through the city's social circles like wildfire. The story had everything gossip lovers craved: old money, family secrets, medical revelations, and a bride with enough backbone to walk away from millions rather than accept deception. That night, I sat in my small apartment above the tailoring shop, Liam sleeping peacefully in my arms, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the deep satisfaction of justice served exactly as it should be. Not through violence or cruelty, but through the simple, inevitable consequences of treating people as disposable. "The world remembers everything, little one," I whispered to my sleeping son. "And sometimes, just sometimes, it makes sure the right people pay the price." The knock came on a Tuesday evening while I was teaching Liam to count buttons on one of Martha's vintage dresses. 3 soft raps, hesitant and almost apologetic. Nothing like the commanding presence Alex once carried through every room he entered. I knew it was him before I opened the door. Martha had called from downstairs to warn me, her voice tight with protective concern. "There's a man here asking for you. Says he's family. Should I send him away?" I told her to let him come up. Some conversations can't be avoided forever, and I'd learned that facing difficult truths head-on was always better than letting them fester in shadows. Alex stood in my doorway looking like a stranger wearing a familiar face. The confident posture was gone, replaced by shoulders that curved inward as if protecting some invisible wound. His expensive suit hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight, and his eyes, those Turner eyes that had once held such cold certainty, now seemed lost, searching for something they'd never find. "Sarah," he said, and even my name sounded different in his mouth. Smaller. Kitten. Liam peeked out from behind my legs, curious about the tall stranger who looked so much like his own reflection in mirrors. I placed a protective hand on my son's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him against my palm, a reminder of everything I'd fought to preserve. "You look different," Alex said, his gaze moving from me to Liam with an expression I couldn't quite read. Wonder maybe. Or grief for something he'd never allowed himself to want. "People change when they stop living lies," I replied, stepping aside to let him enter but keeping myself positioned between him and my son. My small apartment above Martha's shop was nothing like the Turner mansion. No marble floors or crystal chandeliers, no overwhelming sense of old money and older grudges. Just simple furniture, handmade curtains, and the kind of warmth that comes from building something real instead of inheriting something hollow. Alex's eyes took in every detail: the sewing machine in the corner where I worked late into the night, the photos of Liam's milestones covering one wall, the bookshelf filled with children's stories and my old chemistry textbooks. When his gaze finally settled on our son, something in his face cracked open. "He's beautiful," Alex whispered, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice carried genuine emotion. "He looks like his grandfather," I finished. "Kyle would have loved him." The mention of his father's name made Alex flinch as if I'd struck him. He sank into Martha's old armchair without invitation, suddenly looking decades older than his 32 years. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't understand what we were throwing away." I let him speak, watching Liam play with his building blocks while his father, this stranger who shared his DNA, tried to find words for the unfindable. Alex talked about the pressure from his mother, about expectations that had crushed him since childhood, about the fear of disappointing a family that had never learned how to love without conditions. When he finally fell silent, I asked the question that had been burning in my chest for 3 years. "Would you have pushed me down those stairs if you'd known about your father's will?" Alex's face went white. The question hung between us like smoke from a fire that had consumed everything we'd once pretended to be. I didn't push you, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You didn't stop it either. He had no answer for that. We both knew the truth, that he'd stood by while his family orchestrated my destruction, that his silence had been as violent as any physical blow. Please, he said finally, his voice breaking on the word. Let me see him. Let me be part of his life. I'll sign over everything, the house, the money, all of it. I just want a chance to be his father. I looked at Liam, my miracle boy who was building towers with the focused determination he'd inherited from the grandfather he'd never meet. This child who had survived everything they'd thrown at us, who had thrived despite being unwanted, who carried their bloodline without their poison. You had your chance to be his father, I said quietly. You chose to be their son instead. The next months brought a parade of attempts at reconciliation. Stephanie's letters arrived weekly, written on her expensive stationery with words like misunderstanding, and family healing, and what's best for everyone. I returned them unopened, their weight in my hands feeling like anchors trying to drag me back to a place I'd fought too hard to escape. George's gifts were more elaborate. Designer toys for Liam, expensive jewelry for me, even a car title with my name already filled in. Each package went back to sender without being opened. Their guilt might be expensive, but my peace was priceless. Clayton helped me establish the boutique 6 months after the wedding disaster. Liam's legacy occupied a small storefront 3 blocks from Martha's shop, with wide windows that let in morning light and a cheerful blue door that made children smile when they walked past. The shop specialized in handmade children's clothing, little dresses with hand-embroidered flowers, tiny suits perfect for special occasions, christening gowns that would become family heirlooms. Every piece was crafted with the precision I'd learned from Martha and the love I'd discovered through motherhood. Word spread quickly through the community. Parents appreciated the quality, children loved the bright colors and soft fabrics, and I found deep satisfaction in creating beautiful things for families who understood how precious their children were. On slow afternoons, I'd watch Liam play in the shop's corner while I worked, his laughter mixing with the sound of my sewing machine in a symphony of contentment. He was growing into himself, intelligent like his grandfather, determined like his mother, but with a gentleness that came from being truly wanted. The Turner family never stopped trying to insert themselves into our lives. They hired lawyers who were politely dismissed by Clayton, sent social workers who found nothing but a thriving child in a loving home, even attempted to use their social connections to pressure me into contact. But I'd learned something during those dark months in their mansion. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of boundaries so strong that other people's chaos can't touch what you've built. Every evening I'd lock up the shop and climb the stairs to our apartment, where Liam would be waiting with stories about his day and questions about everything from why flowers need water to whether stars have names. After dinner and bath time and bedtime stories, I'd tuck him into his small bed and watch him sleep, this child who had been unwanted by some but was everything to me. In those quiet moments, I felt something I'd never experienced in the Turner mansion, complete and perfect peace. Not because my enemies had suffered, though they had, but because I'd refused to let their poison transform me into something bitter and broken. They'd tried to destroy us and instead they'd set us free. That was the sweetest victory of all. If this story of sweet revenge had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Sarah left that chilling note under Alex's dinner plate. Infertile now. The ultimate checkmate move. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more thrilling stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.